I just, I don't believe Chris could ever do that. He adored his girls. Every picture, every video. He was smiling, holding them, kissing them. How could anyone think he was capable of such a thing?
Chris? No way. He was calm, polite, a family man. I mean, he worked hard, kept to himself, loved his wife. At least that's what we all thought. If you're telling me he's the one responsible, I can't wrap my head around it.
On August 13, 2018, Frederick, Colorado, a quiet suburban town, the kind where nothing bad ever seems to happen, woke up to a nightmare. What began as a missing persons case quickly unraveled into one of the most shocking family murders in modern American history. And at the center of it all, the man everyone thought they knew, the loving husband, the doting father, Chris Watts. At 5:27 a.m., a doorbell camera records Shanann Watts returning home from a business trip. She's carrying her suitcase, tired but smiling faintly, unaware that these would be her last recorded steps. By 8:30 that morning, her phone was silent. No calls, no texts. By noon, she had missed a doctor's appointment for her third pregnancy. By evening, she and her two little girls, Bella and Celeste, were missing. The neighbor's security camera shows only one thing: Chris Watts, her husband, backing his truck into the driveway, loading something into the bed before driving away. Within hours, the case of a missing pregnant mother and her children would become a national obsession. And when the truth came out, the betrayal was almost too much to comprehend. Chris Watts, the father, the husband, the man who once stood in front of television cameras, pleading for his family's return, and yet he was the one who ended their lives. His pregnant wife, Shanann, his 4-year-old daughter, Bella, his 3-year-old daughter, Celeste, and the unborn child they had already named Nico. A family destroyed, not by strangers, not by chance, but by the person they trusted most. But how did this happen? How did a man, described by neighbors as quiet and polite, become the killer of his own family? And what was the moment, the breaking point, that turned a home filled with laughter into a crime scene? By the end of this story, you will hear the confessions, the deceptions, and the betrayals that unmasked the man once seen as the perfect father. Frederick, Colorado, a small town tucked into Weld County, just 30 miles north of Denver, population about 12,000. The kind of place where the biggest headlines came from local football scores, zoning debates, and new housing developments. It was the sort of town families came to when they wanted a quiet life. A backyard, good schools, friendly neighbors. In 2018, the Watts family was one of those families. On the outside, they looked like everything the American dream promised. Shanann Catherine Watts, born Shanann Razuchek, grew up in North Carolina. Friends described her as ambitious, caring, and full of energy. She worked hard, built friendships easily, and loved sharing her life with others. In 2010, she met Chris Watts through mutual friends. Shanann later told people she hadn't been looking for love, but Chris came into her life at just the right time. They married in 2012 and eventually settled in Colorado, where Shanann became a prominent promoter for a health supplement company. She often posted videos on Facebook, sharing her journey as a mom and entrepreneur. For many, she appeared vibrant, confident, and dedicated to her family. But those who knew her best also said she carried a deeper strength. She had been through struggles, health challenges, and disappointments. Her family was her foundation. Her daughters were her joy. Bella Marie Watts was born in 2013, a sweet, shy girl known for her big brown eyes and cautious personality. Celeste, nicknamed CCE, came 2 years later. She was the opposite of her sister, bold, full of energy, and always moving. Together, they balanced each other. Neighbors remembered them riding bikes in the cul-de-sac, chasing bubbles, in the yard, and clinging to their mother's side at community events. Shanann often dressed them in matching outfits, capturing photos that told the world these girls were loved. In 2018, Shanann announced she was pregnant with their third child, a boy they had already named Nico. She filmed the reveal in a playful video, wearing a shirt that read, "Oops, we did it again." While Chris came home from work, she posted his reaction online, showing the world a father smiling at the news of another baby on the way. It was another piece of the family story, a couple, 2 young daughters, and now a baby boy. To friends watching from afar, the Watts home looked picture perfect. Christopher Lee Watts, born in North Carolina in 1985. He studied automotive technology and eventually worked for Anadarko Petroleum, maintaining oil field equipment in Colorado. He was quieter than Shanann, less expressive, but to most people, he seemed reliable. A steady job, a father who played with his daughters, a husband who, at least in public, smiled for family photos. Neighbors called him polite. Co-workers said he was dependable. No one would have described him as dangerous. The Watts family lived on Saratoga Trail in a recently built subdivision. Their two-story house blended into rows of similar homes, occupied by young couples and growing families. In a neighborhood where everyone's lives unfolded on front porches and Facebook feeds, the Watts family fit the mold of ordinary happiness. But as the summer of 2018 unfolded, pressures began to show. Shanann confided in friends that she felt distant from Chris. He seemed distracted, less affectionate, less present. She wondered if something was wrong, but she pushed forward, balancing her work, caring for the girls, and preparing for baby Nico. August 13th would begin like any other Monday in Frederick. Shanann returned home from a business trip in Arizona. The girls were asleep in their beds. Chris was home. By all appearances, a family was together under one roof. But by the next day, the house would be empty. Phones unanswered. Children gone. Shanann missing. The neighbor's security footage would show Chris moving his truck before dawn. And soon the question would emerge, how could a father, a man who lived in this small Colorado town, who raised two daughters and prepared for a son, become the focus of a nationwide manhunt for the murder of his own family? In a town where nothing like this had ever happened before, the mask of suburban peace was ripped away. And the story of the Watts family would soon become one of the most haunting true crime cases in American history. Before the shocking events of August 2018, the Watts family appeared ordinary, even enviable. A neat two-story house on Saratoga Trail, smiling children in photos, a couple that looked like they were building a future together. But beneath that surface, the pressures of life were mounting. And in Frederick, Colorado, a place where crime was rare and life was quiet, no one could have imagined how those pressures would explode. Frederick, Colorado sits in Weld County, one of the fastest-growing counties in the state. Once a mining town, it evolved into a bedroom community for people commuting to Denver and Boulder. Families came for affordable homes, good schools, and safe neighborhoods. By 2018, Frederick had developed the polished look of modern suburbia. Wide streets, tidy lawns, and cul-de-sacs filled with children's bikes. It was a place where neighbors waved across driveways, where family cookouts were common, and where people left their doors unlocked. The idea of a family disappearing and then being found murdered was unthinkable here. That is why, when the story broke, it captured not only local but global attention. It shattered the image of suburban safety. Shanann and Chris Watts married in 2012. Their friends and family described the early years as loving and hopeful. Chris was quiet, reserved, and mechanical in his habits. Shanann was social, expressive, and driven. Together, they balanced each other. Shanann, diagnosed with lupus, often spoke about how Chris supported her during difficult health moments. She credited him for being patient and kind in the early stages of their marriage. But as the years passed, stresses grew. Financial difficulties weighed heavily on the couple. By 2018, they had filed for bankruptcy once and faced mounting credit card and medical debt. Their beautiful new home on Saratoga Trail came with a heavy mortgage. Shanann's health challenges continued, and she poured herself into her work as a promoter for Thrive, a health supplement company. Her social media presence was filled with positivity. Unbeknownst to Shanann, Chris was living a double life. In June 2018, he began a relationship with Nicole Kessinger, a co-worker he met at Anadarko Petroleum. Nicole later told investigators she believed Chris was in the process of separating from his wife. Chris told her his marriage was over, that he was at the end of the relationship, and that they were preparing to split. But in reality, Shanann had no knowledge of this affair. She continued planning for their third child, Nico, and even arranged a gender reveal party. Chris's relationship with Nicole grew rapidly. Phone records later revealed frequent calls, text messages, and internet searches related to planning a new life together. Nicole reported that Chris talked about a future where they could move in together, free of complications. By the summer of 2018, Shanann began noticing changes. In her messages to friends, she confided that Chris was emotionally cold, detached, and unresponsive. He no longer showed affection, and he seemed distracted, always on his phone or withdrawn. In late July, Shanann traveled to North Carolina with the girls for a 5-week trip to visit her family. Chris stayed behind in Colorado. During that time, his affair with Nicole intensified. He was spotted dining with her, vacationing, and spending nights at her home. When Shanann returned, she sensed the gap between them had grown even wider. Friends recalled her saying, "Something is wrong. He's not the Chris I know." Her attempts to confront him about their marriage were met with vague reassurances. But privately, Chris was confiding in Nicole, telling her he was preparing to leave Shanann, and that his future was with her. The cracks in their marriage were not just emotional, they were financial. Court records showed the Watts family filed for bankruptcy in 2015, listing over $70,000 in debt. By 2018, they were again behind on payments. The mortgage on their home was large. Medical expenses piled up. Shanann's Thrive job brought in income, but it also came with pressure to project a perfect, successful image online. Chris worked long hours in the oil fields, but his salary was not enough to cover everything. To outsiders, the Watts home looked stable. Inside, there was mounting pressure, and it was pushing Chris further into the fantasy of a new life. One of the most haunting aspects of this case is how ordinary, even ideal, the Watts family looked from the outside. Shanann documented their life on social media. She shared videos of Chris playing with the girls, photos of family, vacations, and clips of milestones like birthdays and school events. Her feed showed a man smiling at his wife, cradling his children, talking about love and fatherhood. To her followers, the Watts family was inspirational. A modern family balancing kids, careers, and love. But what those posts didn't reveal was the growing emotional distance between Shanann and Chris. What they didn't show was his double life or the weight of their financial struggles. It was a carefully curated image, one that would make the reality all the more shocking when it came crashing down. Friends later said Shanann had begun to sense Chris was hiding something. She worried he no longer loved her. She wondered if there was someone else. Her texts, revealed during the investigation, paint a heartbreaking picture, a woman desperate to save her marriage, clinging to the hope that the man she married could return to her. Chris, meanwhile, was searching online for jewelry and vacation spots, not for Shanann, but for Nicole. As the summer drew to a close, Shanann planned one more business trip to Arizona. She told friends she would confront Chris when she returned. She was ready to demand the truth. But she never got the chance. Frederick, Colorado was a town built on trust. Families left garage doors open. Kids roamed the streets on bikes, and everyone assumed their neighbors lived simple, safe lives. The Watts family appeared to be one of those families, until the morning of August 13, 2018. By the time Shanann walked through the door from her business trip, the tension in their marriage had reached a breaking point. And within hours, their home would become the center of a crime scene that horrified the world. But what exactly happened inside 2825 Saratoga Trail? And how did the first cracks in the story begin to show? By August 2018, the fractures in the Watts marriage had widened. Shanann was determined to save it. Chris was determined to escape it. And on one summer weekend, the two would collide, with consequences no one could have imagined. August 9th. Shanann boarded a flight to Arizona for a Thrive business trip. She checked into her hotel with coworkers, attended meetings, and called home to check on her daughters. Friends noticed she seemed worried. She confided that Chris had been cold and distant. When she reached for him, he pulled away. When she texted him, replies were short and delayed. On August 10th, while Shanann was at her conference, Chris was with Nicole Kessinger. Phone records and credit card receipts later revealed dinner dates, time spent at her home, and searches online about starting a new life. By August 11th, Shanann told a close friend, "I don't know what's going on. He's not the man I married." She resolved that when she returned, she would confront him. She was going to fight for her marriage and for her children. August 12th, Shanann returned to Colorado. That night, she flew into Denver International Airport on a late flight. Her friend and colleague, Nicole Atkinson, drove her home. Nicole later remembered Shanann being quiet, tired, and worried about what awaited her at home. By 1:48 a.m., on August 13th, Shanann stepped through the front door of 2825 Saratoga Trail. It was the last time anyone outside the family would see her alive. What happened between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. inside the Watts home has been pieced together through Chris's eventual confessions, forensic evidence, and investigative documents. Chris claimed that Shanann confronted him about his affair. Words escalated. Shanann told him their marriage was over. At some point, Chris attacked her. He later admitted to strangling her in their bedroom. In his initial interviews, Chris tried to shift blame, suggesting Shanann harmed the children first. But forensic evidence, and later his own admissions, confirmed otherwise. After killing Shanann, Chris turned his attention to Bella and Celeste. He loaded Shanann's body into his truck, placing her on the floorboard. He then brought the girls alive into the truck as well. For nearly an hour, they sat beside their mother's lifeless body as Chris drove toward an oil field owned by his employer, Anadarko Petroleum. At the remote site, Chris smothered Celeste first, then Bella. Bella, just 4 years old, reportedly fought back, crying out, "Daddy, no!" before he ended her life. Chris buried Shanann's body in a shallow grave. He stuffed Bella and Celeste's bodies into oil tanks. By dawn, he drove back, cleaned up, and prepared to face the day as though nothing had happened. August 13, 2018. At 8:30 a.m., Shanann had a doctor's appointment. She never arrived. Nicole Atkinson, concerned after dropping her off just hours earlier, began calling and texting. No answer. By mid-morning, Nicole drove to the Watts home. The car was in the garage. Shanann's purse and keys were inside. But Shanann, Bella, and Celeste were gone. Nicole called the police. By 1:40 p.m., Frederick police officers arrived. Body camera footage shows them entering the quiet house. Upstairs, Shanann's phone was found on the nightstand. Her wedding ring was left behind. Nicole told officers this was not like her friend. Shanann was punctual, organized, always in touch. She would never leave her children, especially pregnant. Police grew suspicious. Neighbors joined in, noting unusual behavior. One neighbor, who had a surveillance camera, showed police footage from the early hours. The video revealed Chris backing his truck into the garage around 5:27 a.m. He was seen making multiple trips, loading items into the vehicle. Chris tried to explain it away, saying he was preparing for work. But officers noted his nervous demeanor, his strange posture, and his lack of concern. By the end of the day, Chris Watts, the husband and father, was no longer just a grieving family man. He was the prime suspect. But what police found next, in his phone records, his internet history, and his interviews, would reveal the depth of his betrayal. And it would transform a missing persons case into one of the most shocking family murder cases in modern American history. By the afternoon of August 13th, the Watts family's disappearance was no longer just a welfare check. It had become a full-scale investigation. Officers noted the strangeness immediately. Shanann's phone left behind, her purse still in the house, her car in the garage with the children's car seats intact. Pregnant, with a doctor's appointment scheduled that day, Shanann would not have vanished voluntarily. And yet, her husband, Chris Watts, seemed oddly calm. His words didn't match his body language. Investigators were watching closely, and soon, every move he made would become a clue. Inside the Watts home, police wore body cameras that would later be released to the public. On that footage, Chris appears nervous, pacing, talking quickly. He offered explanations no one had asked for. He mentioned arguments with Shanann, but downplayed them. Detectives noted the inconsistencies. Why would Shanann leave her wedding ring behind? Why were her medications untouched? Why would she vanish with 2 small children and no car? Neighbors added more concerns. One, who had surveillance footage, showed officers a recording from his camera. At 5:27 a.m., the neighbor, visibly uncomfortable, told police, "He's not acting right. He never loads his truck like that." From that moment, suspicion shifted sharply. Chris Watts was no longer a worried husband. He was a potential suspect. On August 14th, Chris stood on his porch for a television interview. Cameras captured him pleading for Shanann, Bella, and Celeste to come home. He wore a plain t-shirt, arms folded tightly. His tone was flat, his eyes darting. He said, "Shanann, if you're out there, just come back. If somebody has her, just bring her back. I need to see everybody again. This house is not complete without anybody here." But viewers at home saw something else. His lack of emotion was glaring. His story was thin. Online, armchair detectives began dissecting his every gesture. The court of public opinion was already building a case against him. Detectives invited Chris to take a polygraph test on August 15th. He agreed. Inside the interrogation room, Chris sat with his arms folded, avoiding eye contact. Polygraph examiner Tammy Lee administered the test. Before beginning, she told him, "This is your chance to clear your name." Chris failed almost immediately. His responses about Shanann, Bella, and Celeste showed deception. When the results came in, Tammy Lee leaned forward and told him directly, "There's no way you're telling the truth right now." It was a pivotal moment. Chris was cornered, and investigators pressed harder. After failing the polygraph, Chris was confronted by detectives. They urged him to tell the truth. Chris asked to speak to his father, Ronnie Watts. In that private conversation, recorded by investigators, Chris admitted that Shanann was dead, but he shifted blame, claiming he killed her only after she strangled the children. It was a desperate attempt to deflect responsibility. Investigators knew the truth was darker, but this was the crack they needed. Chris Watts was arrested on August 15, 2018. The next step was to find Shanann, Bella, and Celeste. Forensic evidence would seal the case. Detectives analyzed phone records, GPS data, and search histories. They discovered, and Chris's phone pinged near the Anadarko oil site early on August 13th. He had searched online for phrases like how to lie detector tests and how long someone can go missing before they're considered dead, and deleted texts to and from Nicole Kessinger, his girlfriend, in an attempt to erase his digital trail. Meanwhile, cadaver dogs alerted inside the Watts home. One dog stopped in the master bedroom. Another paused at the base of the stairs. The scent of death was unmistakable. On August 16th, investigators went to the oil site. There, they found Shanann's body in a shallow grave. Bella and Celeste were discovered inside oil tanks. The nightmare was confirmed. As detectives unraveled the case, one name kept appearing: Nicole Kessinger. Nicole was interviewed extensively. She told investigators Chris had lied to her, claiming he was separating from Shanann. She said she had no idea Shanann was pregnant, and no idea of the plan Chris carried out. Phone records showed she deleted Google searches after Chris's arrest. Searches like, "Can people track phone records?" and "Amber Frey," a reference to the mistress in the Scott Peterson case. Public outrage toward her was intense, though no charges were ever filed. Investigators determined she had no role in the murders. Still, her involvement painted the picture of Chris's motive. He wanted a new life, free of his wife and children. Initially, Chris maintained his partial confession that Shanann killed the children, and he killed Shanann in a rage. But the forensic evidence told another story. No defensive wounds on Shanann. No evidence she harmed the girls. In November 2018, Chris took a plea deal. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, he confessed to murdering Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and unborn baby Nico. The truth was finally spoken aloud. He had strangled Shanann at home, smothered his daughters, and disposed of them at the oil site. The investigation was over, but the trial was still to come. And when Chris Watts entered the courtroom, the nation would hear not only his confession, but the heartbreak of Shanann's family, who demanded justice for the daughters and grandchild they lost. The case had shifted from interrogation rooms to the halls of justice. And the question remained, what sentence could possibly measure against the enormity of this crime? By November 2018, the investigation into Chris Watts had come to a close. What remained was the courtroom, a place where lies collapse under the weight of truth and where families stand to confront the one who betrayed them. On November 6, 2018, Chris Watts entered the Weld County Courthouse in Greeley, Colorado. Cameras waited outside, journalists filled the seats, and Shanann's family sat together in silence. Chris faced 9 charges, on 5 counts of first-degree murder, 1 for Shanann, 2 for Bella, 2 for Celeste. Each child receiving an additional count because they were under 12, 1 count of unlawful termination of a pregnancy for unborn baby Nico, and 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. The prosecution had built an airtight case, but they made one decision that surprised many. In exchange for Chris's guilty plea, they agreed not to pursue the death penalty. The district attorney, Michael Rourke, explained that Shanann's family had requested this. They did not want to prolong the case with years of appeals. They wanted closure. So Chris Watts, the husband and father who had gone on television pleading for his family's safe return, now stood in court and admitted to murdering them all. During the proceedings, the prosecution laid out the brutality of the crime. District Attorney Rourke described how Shanann was strangled in her bed, how Bella and Celeste were smothered, how their bodies were hidden in crude, degrading ways at the oil site. He spoke of betrayal, of premeditation, and of a man who had planned to erase his family for a new life. The defense had little to offer. With a guilty plea secured, their strategy shifted towards sparing Chris further condemnation. They emphasized that by pleading guilty, Chris had spared Shanann's family the ordeal of a trial. But in the eyes of the court and the nation, there was no mercy left for him. On November 19, 2018, the sentencing hearing began. For the first time, Shanann's family had the chance to speak directly to the judge and to Chris. Frank Razuchek, Shanann's father, stood at the podium. His voice broke as he said, "I trusted you to take care of them, not kill them, and they trusted you. Shanann's mother, Sandra, told Chris she forgave him, but she also demanded that he think about what he had done every day of his life. Her brother, Frankie Razuchek Jr., was less forgiving. He described the pain of losing his sister and nieces, saying Chris deserved nothing but the harshest punishment. Their words cut through the silence of the courtroom, leaving Chris staring at the table, shoulders slumped. He showed no visible emotion. After hours of testimony and legal arguments, Judge Marcelo Kopkow delivered the sentence. Chris Watts was sentenced to 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole, an additional 48 years for the unlawful termination of Shanann's pregnancy, another 36 years for tampering with the bodies. The sentences would run consecutively, ensuring Chris would never leave prison alive. Judge Kopkow called it the most inhumane and vicious crime I have handled in my career. And with the bang of a gavel, Chris Watts' life as a free man ended. Yet, even with the guilty plea and sentencing, questions lingered. Why did Chris do it? What led him to murder his pregnant wife and 2 daughters instead of choosing divorce? And in the months that followed, from inside a prison cell in Wisconsin, Chris Watts would finally tell investigators his full account of that night, an account more horrifying than anything the courtroom had heard. November 19, 2018. The gavel fell in Weld County Court, and Chris Watts was sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Shanann's family, it marked the end of one battle, but the beginning of another, because no sentence, no punishment, could bring back Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and baby Nico. The world had watched this case unfold, from Shanann's disappearance to Chris's shocking arrest, to the courtroom where he admitted his guilt. But the story didn't end with the judge's words. In the aftermath, grief, outrage, and reflection swept across Colorado, across the country, and across the world. Frank and Sandra Razuchek, Shanann's parents, became the voice of resilience. In the courtroom, they had spoken directly to Chris, demanding accountability, but afterward, their focus turned toward remembering their daughter and granddaughters, not just as victims, but as vibrant lives taken too soon. For the Razuchek family, this meant 2 things: a bittersweet reminder of what was lost, and a way to ensure Shanann's story was never forgotten. In the weeks after the sentencing, the community of Frederick, Colorado came together. Candlelight vigils were held. Friends and strangers stood side by side, holding photos of Shanann and the children, whispering prayers. The town erected memorials, flowers, stuffed animals, handwritten notes, outside the Watts family home. Though the house stood as a place of horror, the memorials reclaimed it as a site of remembrance. One message left on the porch simply read, "You are loved, you are missed, justice is served, but we will never forget you." The quiet suburban street, once anonymous, had become a place etched in memory. The public response was raw. Across social media, thousands expressed their anger. They questioned Chris's lack of remorse, his betrayal of his family, and his cold demeanor. For many, the case became more than just a crime story. It became a conversation about trust, betrayal, and the warning signs of domestic violence. Advocates pointed out that family annihilation, where a husband or father murders his spouse and children, was tragically not unique. Similar cases had unfolded across the country. But Chris Watts became the face of it in the modern era, amplified by social media and relentless news coverage. The case of Chris Watts dominated headlines for months. The contrast between Chris's smiling family photos and the brutality of his actions was irresistible to the media and horrifying to the public. The story became not just about what happened, but why it happened. And in that question, millions found themselves looking inward, asking how something so devastating could emerge from a home that looked so normal. Beyond the headlines, advocacy groups saw the case as a painful but powerful tool for education. Shanann's story became an example in discussions about coercive control, financial stress, and emotional abuse that may not leave visible scars but can lead to devastating outcomes. Experts emphasize that Chris's affair with Nicole Kessinger was not the sole reason for the murders, but part of a larger pattern of deception and desire for control. For domestic violence advocates, the message was clear. The warning signs may not always be visible, but silence can be deadly. From Colorado to across the nation, Shanann's name became part of campaigns, reminding communities to speak up when something feels wrong. The Watts family home at 2825 Saratoga Trail became a landmark of grief and horror. For months, it sat abandoned. The lawn grew untended, the house fell into foreclosure, and neighbors tried to avoid the sight of it. But still, people came. Curious strangers, true crime enthusiasts, and those simply trying to pay their respects left flowers at the steps. For the neighbors, the house was no longer part of a quiet suburban development. It was a scar, a constant reminder of what had happened behind its walls. Shanann's family fought for her memory. The community mourned. The nation debated. But even as Chris Watts began serving his life sentence, questions still lingered. Why? Why would a man with a home, a job, and a family choose annihilation over separation? And what, if anything, could have stopped him before it was too late? The courtroom had delivered its verdict. Chris Watts was sentenced to life in prison for the murders of Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and unborn baby Nico. On paper, the case was closed. But outside the walls of the Weld County Courthouse, the public wasn't ready to stop asking questions. The brutality of the crime, the lack of a clear motive, the ease with which Chris spoke of his family in past tense. It all left a haunting gap. And in that gap, theories began to form. Was the crime a sudden act of rage, or was it carefully planned? Prosecutors argued it was premeditated. Chris had been distancing himself from Shanann, withdrawing money, and searching for a fresh start. The morning of the murders, he backed his truck into the garage to hide his movements. But Chris himself, in later prison interviews, suggested it wasn't planned in advance, that he simply snapped after Shanann confronted him about the affair. This contradiction left many unsettled, because the details, smothering his children one by one, disposing of bodies at a work site, pointed toward calculation, not a momentary lapse. Was it rage? Or a carefully constructed plan for a new life? One fact that stunned the public was Chris's decision to take a polygraph test. On August 15th, just days after Shanann and the girls were reported missing, he sat across from investigators and agreed to the exam. Polygraphs are not admissible in court, but they are powerful tools for investigation. Within minutes, Chris failed. The examiner later said it was one of the clearest failures she had ever seen. For many, the willingness to sit for that test, knowing he was guilty, raised questions. Was he overconfident? Did he believe he could manipulate the results? Or was he already so numb to the truth that he didn't care? Another painful debate surrounded the order of the murders. In his initial confession, Chris claimed Shanann killed the children, and he killed her in rage. That story quickly collapsed under forensic evidence. In his later prison interview with the FBI, he admitted he killed Shanann first, then smothered Bella and Celeste. But here, too, the details shifted. Some experts questioned whether Bella had fought back. Her injuries suggested she may have struggled. These contradictions left lingering questions. Why did Chris change his story? Was he protecting his ego, even in confession? Or was there still some part of the timeline investigators hadn't fully uncovered? Perhaps the most enduring theory wasn't about who else was involved, but whether this tragedy could have been prevented. Chris had presented himself as the quiet family man. But in hindsight, there were red flags. Friends noticed his sudden fitness obsession and secretive behavior. Shanann texted friends about feeling distant, about Chris pulling away emotionally. His coworkers would later say they noticed him distracted, withdrawn, and uncharacteristically cold. None of these signs pointed directly to murder, but they raised a haunting question. Could intervention have saved Shanann and the children? Theories about the case filled online forums. Some speculated Shanann's social media presence put pressure on Chris, painting a picture of a perfect family he no longer wanted. Others claimed financial stress drove him to erase his obligations. But the fact that these theories thrived revealed something deeper. The public struggled to reconcile the image of the smiling family man with the reality of a father who could destroy his entire family. And so, the debate continues. Did Chris Watts act entirely alone, driven by selfishness and desperation? Or did others, knowingly or unknowingly, help push him toward the unthinkable? What do you think? If you were on that jury, or sitting in that interrogation room, would you believe Chris acted in isolation? Or do you believe there are still missing pieces to this puzzle? November 2018. The courtroom was packed as Chris Watts stood before the judge one last time. The official resolution was clear. Chris Watts would never again walk free. But outside the courthouse, the questions didn't stop. And inside the prison walls, new revelations would keep the public haunted. Chris Watts was transferred to the Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin, a maximum security facility more than 1,000 miles from his home in Frederick, Colorado. The transfer was reportedly for his own safety, after authorities deemed him too notorious to remain in Colorado. Inside prison, reports described Chris as quiet, reserved, and often isolated. He worked in custodial duties, kept a low profile, and spent long hours in his cell reading the Bible. In letters and limited interviews, he spoke of finding religion, claiming forgiveness and repentance. To some, these statements seemed hollow, attempts to rewrite his own legacy. To others, it was further proof of his manipulation. While Chris's future was cemented behind prison walls, Shanann's legacy grew louder. Her parents, Frank and Sandra Razuchek, became advocates for domestic violence awareness. They spoke at events, reminding others that even families who appear picture-perfect may be hiding dangerous realities. Shanann's videos and Facebook posts, once casual updates about family life, and her work in health and wellness, became archives of remembrance. They showed her joy, her struggles, her love for her daughters. For many who watched them, Shanann became more than a victim. She became a symbol of resilience and motherhood, her voice echoing long after her life was taken. The house at 2825 Saratoga Trail in Frederick, Colorado, became a silent landmark. Foreclosed and abandoned, it was left empty for years. Neighbors called it a scar on the neighborhood, a constant reminder of the crime. Reporters filmed its empty windows, the once pristine lawn overgrown. Some true crime enthusiasts even visited, leaving flowers or filming outside. Eventually, the house passed quietly into the possession of banks and foreclosure courts, but its reputation never changed. To the community, it wasn't a home. It was a monument to betrayal. Unlike many family homicide cases, the story of Chris Watts refused to fade. The case became larger than itself, not just a tragedy, but a cultural conversation about family annihilation, hidden abuse, and the darkness that can live behind closed doors. Legally, the case of the Watts family murders is closed. Chris Watts confessed. He was convicted. He will never walk free. But emotionally, socially, and culturally, the case remains open. Because every time someone watches Shanann's videos, every time someone revisits Chris's porch interview, the chilling image of a man pleading for his family's return while knowing exactly where they were, the questions return. Why did he do it? Why kill not just Shanann, but Bella and Celeste, too? Was it freedom he sought? Control? Or something far darker inside him? The resolution of the Watts case gave answers on paper, but in the hearts of those who knew Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico, and in the minds of millions who followed every detail, the story doesn't feel resolved. Because no sentence can fill the silence left behind, and no confession can truly explain why. If this story touched you, stay with us. Thank you for watching. If this case intrigued you, hit the subscribe button for more true crime stories.